I'm Sarah Clemens. I'm an extension educator with University of Minnesota Extension and our Center for Family Development. And I'm so pleased today that Cari Michaels is going to be sharing with us about mental well-being, because I know I need to take some deep breaths this morning as I was jumping on the webinar and trying to find links and everything. So let's go ahead and Sherry's got the recording started. So Cari, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and get us started. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and congratulations on taking this hour to focus on your own mental well-being. I hope we'll all learn some new things from one another. This has been a growing field, especially during these past 2 years, so I'm glad for the opportunity to talk with all of you. As Sarah mentioned, we will be recording this session today, and the slides will also be available to you along with any resources that I share or talk about. So rest assured that you will be able to get this information afterward. My name is Cari Michaels, and I'm a public health educator. I'm also an extension educator at the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Family Development. I focus on mental health and well-being for individuals, families, workplaces, organizations, communities. And throughout my career, my work has all focused on helping develop education and interventions that strengthen families and children. I believe that the field of public health has a lot to offer this growing field of mental health promotion. I want to thank Sherry for your assistance today. Sherry is on the call and she is available at this number and this email to provide any support that you might need for any tech issues you experience. She will also be monitoring the chat, which I hope will be active in the next hour. So thank you, Sherry. This session today is part of a series hosted by the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Family Development, and it's called Finding Balance. And it includes 2 upcoming sessions. I encourage you to attend these as well. And then you can also search for all of our webinars at this address, and I will put it in the chat. And I'll share this slide at the end too. But we have lots of webinars and resources for you. And I'd like to start just by asking you to participate in a poll about why you're participating today. So Sherry, if you could launch the poll. This is just helpful for us in planning any future webinars. And it looks like we have a whole lot of people who are here for both personal and professional use. I find that's often the case with this topic. It always has relevance to our lives. So thank you for completing that for us. That helps us as we do these webinars in the future. Okay, this session is about taking stock in the experiences that we're facing that affect our mental health and learning strategies to understand and care for ourselves and others in our communities. This is a process that can take time and it can become a way of life. For some, it might represent a different way of looking at the term mental health. For others, it serves as a reminder of the importance of putting our mental well-being as individuals and family members and colleagues and citizens at the forefront of our focus. As we all know, there has been and continues to be a fair amount of stigma associated with mental health and well-being. This means that people struggle not only with their situation that they're facing, but also with social rejection and prejudice and barriers to seeking support. My hope is that as we talk more and more about this, that stigma will decline and that we can speak specifically about mental well-being as a way to bridge the gap and help reduce some of that stigma. We might today address topics that are sensitive for you or issues that are particularly challenging to you. I invite you to step back as you need to care for yourself as we move through this content, and also note what's challenging and consider that after this session. How might you care for yourself around this topic? I will also present a series of questions today as we talk for you to think about or for you to respond to in the chat. Feel free to respond however you're most comfortable. I hope that the questions give you an opportunity to think about your own mental well-being and reflect on how we and our communities can flourish. I also invite you to put your own questions in the chat as we move ahead, We will have time for a question and answer at the end, and time at that point to unmute and talk to one another. So my first question is, I invite you to share in the chat the barriers that keep you from caring for your own mental health. What are your barriers? And as you're thinking about that, I have given this a little bit of thought, so I will share my own. My first one is since I read about this and learn about this and talk about this a lot, I have a lot of ideas about what to do for my own self-care. My struggle is keeping a routine. So I try a lot of new things, but I have a hard time keeping a routine of self-care, making it an ongoing part of my life. So it's helpful actually for me to present myself with this question and answer it, because every time I talk about this, I try to incorporate something else into my routine. And then another challenge for me is I have a habit of keeping that to-do list in front of me and thinking that I'll feel better if I just get it done. But the list keeps growing and I don't get it done, which isn't good for my mental health. So one barrier for me is being uncomfortable with that to-do list and having a hard time letting some things go. And that's kind of a lifelong thing that I work on. And I've gotten a lot better actually at knowing there will always be a growing to-do list. And I see that we have some responses in the chat. I'm just going to ask Sherry to share some of those. Are you there, Sherry?
Oh, sorry. Family and others that need assistance. I put my own needs on the back burner. Barriers, bringing wellness into the workplace. As a mother, it seems selfish. Overreaching on what all I can handle. Time adding more and not able to keep up. Single parents, helping parents with health issues, poor work-life balance when working remote. Routine can be challenging.
Thank you. These are all very familiar to me. Many of them I relate to myself, and I'm just gonna call out that idea of work-life balance. I think it's one of the things that many of us struggle with in general, but also struggle with particularly if we're working at home. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But thank you for sharing your barriers. I'm hoping we can find some ways to address some of them in the next hour. Before we go any further, I want to invite you to join me in one of the activities from a mental flourishing toolkit that we're developing within Extension. This activity is a type of mindful breathing called box breathing. Mindful breathing in general can help ground us in the present moment, and it's particularly helpful in times of acute stress. I find it something that I began to use kind of regularly just to be more centered. Box breathing is easy to understand if mindful breathing is new to you, and it's also easy to do together online. So I do it frequently when I'm in situations like this. Feel free to join in or step back as that works for you. If you are sitting, I invite you to relax your shoulders, straighten your back, rest your feet on the floor, relax your body. You can close your eyes after we get started. I will talk through this once and then we'll practice it 2 or 3 times. We'll practice it 3 times. I'm going to draw a box in the air. And as I draw the first side, we breathe in through our nose for the count of 4. As I draw the second side, we hold for 4. As I draw the bottom, we breathe out through our mouth for 4. And as I draw the last side, we hold for 4. So here we go. Breathe in through your nose, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out through your mouth, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. In through the nose, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out through the mouth, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. One more time, in through the nose, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. Out through the mouth, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. Thank you for joining me in this practice. It is one of the many mindful breathing activities that we insert into classes and trainings as a way to center participants in the space and prepare for learning. And I can share this and other types of mindful breathing with you. First, we're going to dive into the difficult job of examining the situation that we're facing right now. First, the spread of disease and death due to COVID that we are experiencing is associated with fear and grief, which results in mental health struggles. Social restriction leads to isolation and unemployment or underemployment, which exacerbates mental health struggles. The rates of anxiety and depression among US adults and among youth have increased significantly during the last 2 years. And many people are untreated now as they were before the pandemic. The rates of COVID outbreaks have actually paralleled rates of anxiety and depression. This same study also shows that, understandably, as Americans are running this marathon of COVID and experiencing these rising rates of mental health struggles, the healthcare providers that are tasked with helping them are experiencing the same struggles with anxiety and depression. Many have called what we're experiencing now a mental health pandemic. And it'll take some time for us to move through this. There will likely be lasting effects, and taking care of our mental health is really more critical now at this time and into the future. This virus has also exposed and increased existing inequalities of wealth and gender and race. People of color have experienced a particularly high physical and mental health toll of the pandemic. These are death rates among different racial groups. Because more people in these populations have limited access to healthcare and financial resources and greater exposure to the virus due to occupation, jobs like frontline workers, essential workers, critical infrastructure workers, or housing conditions that promote spread, they have experienced more sickness, more hospitalization, and more deaths. So what are our specific challenges? It can be helpful to name these and to be clear about what we're facing. And we'll begin by the idea of ambiguous loss. This is a term that was coined by Dr. Pauline Boss, a faculty member in Family Social Science at the University of Minnesota. The definition of ambiguous loss is a loss that remains unclear and full of uncertainty. We don't know all the facts. Regarding our situation right now, we don't know if we're going to contract COVID, or how effective our vaccine or our booster shot is, or if we should enter social spaces if we've been isolated. The future is unknown. We don't know whether and if this pandemic will end. We don't know how our economy will fare. We're not sure how our children or the next generation will be affected. The situation with ambiguous loss can't be clarified or cured or fixed. We have things we can do to manage this pandemic, but we can't make it go away. We can't fix it. And ambiguous losses can be physical or psychological or both. And we've had many types of losses this year: financial losses, family and community loss, loss of rituals and routines, things that give us structure and engagement with the world. The world is not a predictable place. So we have a loss of trust, loss of control over our daily schedules, freedom loss, loss of safety. There are significant losses associated with sickness and death, of course. And even then, we have a loss of not being able to be with people and mourn in the ways that we typically would. So Dr. Boss says naming the problem of ambiguous loss helps people understand that the stressor is not only the virus, but also the many ambiguous losses that go along with it. So my next question for you to think about or to put in the chat is, what types of losses have you been experiencing? And as you're thinking about that, I will share my own. One of my losses in the last couple of years associated with the pandemic is not being more connected with my family, particularly the older generation in my family. My mother-in-law passed away this past year, and my mother is now in hospice care. And I didn't expect their end of life time to be so isolated, so different than their earlier lives. So that's one clear loss that I've experienced. Another is the loss of participating in my teenagers' developmental milestone events in ways that I would have expected, events that just haven't happened. Things like high school music events and sports events, college parents' weekends, things that are meaningful to kids if they get to experience them, and they just didn't happen in the last couple of years due to safety reasons. So I'm going to ask Sherry, could you please share what people are sharing in the chat?
Yes, so Joyce says socialization. Becca has canceling work programs due to low participation. Predictability. John, loss of connections with family and friends, social interaction, normal life. Brittany says being pregnant but not having typical experiences such as support system present at appointments. Routine. Death of family and friends due to COVID, not being able to plan and schedule things.
Yes, thank you. We have a wide-ranging list of losses, and I want to acknowledge the really significant loss of life as a result of the pandemic, and a lot of sickness being just really at the forefront of our losses. And I also think it's really helpful to name all the other losses that have gone along with this. It's just not a time that we can predict, and it for many affects people to their core, because it's a loss of security. We can't expect things to be the same again. So because of these losses, we are also experiencing high levels of grief. By definition, grief is a feeling of sorrow, suffering, or distress. It's usually based on significant loss. We might experience grief associated with any of these things that we've just listed and shared. So it's not surprising if we feel common grief reactions during this time: shock, denial, anxiety, anger, periods of sadness, loss of sleep or appetite, all very common responses to loss. This has also been a time of isolation and loneliness. Several of you have mentioned that. Social isolation means having few relationships or infrequent social contact. Loneliness means feeling alone regardless of your social contact. So in this country, social isolation was already identified as a major public health concern before the pandemic began. And the number of people feeling lonely, reporting that they're feeling lonely, has increased as the pandemic has gone on. In the US, it's actually younger generations that now report more loneliness than older generations, maybe partly due to living alone, technology use. I've read that some young adults report the absence of anyone reaching out and checking in and asking how they're doing in a meaningful way. Social isolation and loneliness can affect mental health, certainly. They're associated with higher rates of depression and anxiety, suicidality, sleep disorders, but they also affect physical health. Cardiovascular disease and diabetes and obesity and immune system issues are all related to isolation and loneliness. Cognitive health, general cognitive functioning, dementia, Alzheimer's, all have connections to isolation and loneliness. And economic health, there is more medical spending, lower productivity, more absenteeism. Many of these symptoms have worsened during the time of COVID. And I find it interesting that both in Japan and in the UK, there are ministers for loneliness, appointed government positions created because of the significance of this issue. And I'm hopeful that we will pay more attention to this in the US as we emerge from this pandemic. And finally, for many, this is a time of trauma. A person experiences trauma when they experience an emotional response to a terrible event, such as when they are subject to or witness injury or threat of injury. The injury can be physical or psychological or both. And traumatic events are defined not just by what happens, by the nature of the event, but also by a person's perception of it as overwhelming. And overwhelming is a word that I've just heard throughout these last couple of years. It's an experience a lot of us have had. In addition to the pandemic, which has been called a global communal trauma, trauma also happens when we directly experience violent acts and when we witness them, perhaps on television. The murder of George Floyd and those that came before and after his has increased awareness of trauma and related mental health struggles for everyone. Some people and communities have long-term experiences with trauma due to racism, hate, oppression, discrimination, sometimes over generations. For many, this type of trauma has been long-term and a generational experience. It's not new. Many more people now are aware of the effects of trauma on people and on whole communities. So part of supporting mental well-being for ourselves and for our communities is about addressing trauma. All three of these, ambiguous loss and grief and trauma, can affect our window of tolerance. And to explain this, first consider the middle of this picture. When you're within your window of tolerance, we can deal with what's happening. Bad things might still happen, but we have the resources to respond. The window of tolerance is shown on the left and right here in yellow. When pandemics or violence or isolation or trauma happens, our window shrinks, as on the left-hand side. And that's happened to many of us. It's easier for us to experience either hyperarousal, where we can't calm down, or hypoarousal, where we're shutting down and we struggle to stay engaged. We might be depressed. But we can expand our window of tolerance, as on the right-hand side, with help and support and self-care, which we'll talk about in a bit. Mental health promotion includes many types of work, and it's important to change the big picture situations that affect the mental health of entire populations or generations. And it's also important for me to increase my own window of tolerance for the things that are outside of my control. If I can regulate myself when I face stressful and traumatic situations, then I can keep doing the work to change the bigger picture for all of us. So what is mental health and how do we know when we have it? People in different places and cultures understand the terms mental health and mental illness differently. There are varied definitions and perspectives and languages. I am going to share some thoughts about how the general understanding in our country has changed. The general understanding of mental health in the US in recent years has shifted. And this general narrative, or the way that people tend to understand and talk about mental health, has changed with new research, new understanding of the brain and its development, and more openness to talking about and understanding mental well-being. So we're learning from one another as more people are willing to open up. In general, we used to have this old narrative that we don't really use anymore. And this was actually done by a national study by the Frameworks Institute in 2010, not all that long ago. And the old narrative says that mental illness is exclusively a brain disorder. And it's specifically about chemicals, which are caused by genes, which are set in stone for life. It says that mental health and mental illness are the same thing. The old narrative says that mental illness is a medical condition that can only be addressed by a medical professional. Medication then is the logical response for everyone. Treatment is designed to temporarily rebalance chemicals, and there's no ultimate cure for mental illness. Also, from the old narrative, mental illness is a character flaw. There's no room for how environmental influences affect functioning. Mental well-being is the same as happiness. It's about emotional health only, or having positive feelings, being happy. And finally, that mental well-being is a choice, that people can make themselves better if they only try hard enough. So again, that's all the old mental health narrative. And unfortunately, we have a new narrative, which is based on new research, but also new intervention practices, reduced stigma, and more open conversation. And this was drawn from the Minnesota Department of Health. And the new narrative states that brains are built through experience. Changing our experiences can change our mental health. Fear, trauma, and chronic stress negatively impact our mental health and well-being. We can sometimes improve our well-being by focusing on these. Our environment, where we live, work, learn, play, impacts our mental health. Resilience is not enough in the face of oppression. Recovery isn't just about individual strength or grit. Physical health and mental health are intertwined. Culture shapes our definitions and our understanding of mental health. Language differs, treatments differ, recovery differs. Positive relationships are central to mental health. They promote healing. Mental health happens in and through community. It's not just about the individual. We can study and learn and define mental health as a community and examine how communities are doing with mental well-being and mental flourishing. And then finally, mental health requires a sense of purpose and power in your life. And I would add one more here, which is that everyone has a role and a responsibility in promoting mental health. It's not okay to relegate this field to those who are trained to treat mental illness. That is a very important piece of the puzzle, but I'm excited about this shift where we're inviting everyone to the table to talk about mental well-being. It allows us to address mental health promotion, and I think it also helps start to reduce stigma. And we'll talk a little bit more about some ways to look at that are a little bit more inclusive of all of us. So my next question is, what in this new narrative resonates with you? It might be something new to you or something you could keep in mind to support your own mental well-being. So is there something in the new narrative that you just heard that resonates with you? And as you're thinking about that, I will share my own. Something that I have kept in mind over the years is that resilience is not enough. Personally, I'm an introvert and I tend to turn inward to handle struggle, but sometimes I need to find outside supports. The critical importance of relationships in mental well-being resonates with me. And then professionally, I can't focus all of my time and energy on helping individuals build resilience. I have to address outside forces in the environment that affect the mental health of all of us. So those are two things that I think about a lot when I learned about the new narrative and experienced that in our culture. And I see that you're sharing things in the chat. Thank you for that. Sherry, could you share with us what people are saying?
Yes, Maggie shared that all are welcome at the table to talk about mental health. Becca, mental health is everyone's responsibility. Joyce shared more openness about mental health.
Great, thank you. The field really is changing, and actually I would say the field of mental health promotion is growing. We haven't really spoken about it as its own field. So I do like that everyone's at the table. There's a role for all of us to play in mental health promotion. So along with a new narrative, we have a much broader definition of mental health. The World Health Organization states that mental health is a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. And we're going to pull that apart a little bit in our next few slides. This is a model that was created by Dr. Corey Keyes, and I think of it as kind of the foundation of how I think about mental health and prepare for this kind of conversation. As we said, we used to think about mental health and mental illness as the same thing, or maybe opposite ends of a spectrum. And he was the first person to separate them into two different spectra. So here we have illness on the horizontal axis. So severe mental illness on the left-hand side, and no mental illness on the right-hand side. And then we have functioning on the vertical axis, poor mental health functioning on the bottom, and optimal mental health functioning on the top. So what this does is it divides the population into 4 different quadrants. And this is not set in stone. We're all represented here and we move around depending on our life experiences. So the people who are in quadrant 1 have good mental health with no mental illness. And we call that flourishing. And I actually use the terms mental health, mental well-being, and mental flourishing interchangeably. The people in quadrant 2 have severe stress on their mental health with no mental illness, and we call that languishing. People in quadrant 3, severe stress on their mental health with a mental illness, languishing, and mental illness. And then the people in quadrant 4 have good mental health and a mental illness. They're flourishing in spite of the fact that they have a mental illness. And what this does is it, first of all, reminds us that about the fact that a person can experience significant struggle without illness. Those are the people in quadrant 2, or good mental health with illness, the people in quadrant 4. And I think we have in the past tended to forget about those two areas. The other thing that this does is it introduces the idea of mental flourishing, which is the top half. So I'm not a clinician. I'm not necessarily helping people move from left to right, but I do want everybody to flourish regardless of whether or not they have a diagnosis. And I think that that's kind of a public health role to work with whole populations of people to promote well-being. I also think that working with this model helps us reduce stigma. It's not just about those who are sick and those who are well, it's about all of us. So I'm going to ask you to think about this question. Where do you fall on this model right now? And remember that it's always changing. For me, I will share my answer. I experience some anxiety, which puts me on the left-hand side, but it's not severe and it's managed pretty well, which puts me up in the top half. So I put myself in quadrant 4, and I also recognize that that has shifted around throughout my life. I appreciate being able to come back to this model, particularly during times when I might be creeping down toward languishing. It helps me keep my own needs for self-care and supportive resources at the forefront of my mind. So what is flourishing? If we're going to help people move up, we have to know when we're successful. So what exactly is mental flourishing? There are several scales of this now. I'm going to show a scale by Dr. Keyes, the same person who created the dual continuum model. To flourish requires both positive emotions and positive functioning. These are the things that pull us into a healthy and engaged life. First, to flourish, you need an emotional component, which means that you're feeling well. You mostly feel happy, calm, satisfied with your life. You're mostly interested in your life. Second, you need a psychological component, which means that you're functioning well as an individual. So you have positive and warm relationships. You like yourself and your personality. You have self-acceptance. You have a sense of identity and purpose, or you believe that your life has meaning. You strive for personal growth. You're able to adapt your environment to meet your needs. And you have a sense of self-direction or autonomy. And third, you need a social component. And this is really relevant during these past 2 years. And now as we reconfigure our social circles and get comfortable again with people, this means that you're functioning well with others. You believe that people accept and care about one another. You believe that society is improving for people like you, or social actualization. You have a sense of community or connectedness. You contribute to society and you believe that your contribution is useful. And finally, you find engagement with people meaningful. You have a sense of social coherence. We don't need to have mastered all of these things to flourish in life. According to the scale, to flourish, we need 1 emotional component and 6 either psychological or social components. And this is actually this scale is based on the scale for depression. So it pulls out the same sorts of components. And given this definition, we can do a lot more than help people manage illness. We can do a whole lot to promote mental wellness. So my next question for the chat is to identify 2 or 3 of your mental health strengths. And again, as you're thinking about that, I will share my own responses. I am fortunate to have a sense of community or communities that I belong to. These have been challenged during the time of COVID, but I know they're still there for me. So I do feel a connection with community. And another is a sense of identity and purpose. This too is always changing and is not always strong, but in general, I feel like I have a pretty clear sense of meaning in my life. Any others? I see a couple in the chat. Sherry?
Yes, Sarah shared support system, religion, and Maggie's sense of purpose is really important for me. My faith. John shared social connections during COVID via phone, social media.
Great, thank you. One of the things that knowing about this definition of mental flourishing has helped me keep in mind what I'm missing or what I might need to work on or grow during this isolated time. And for me, social connections during COVID, as you said, John, is just really what comes to the front. As I mentioned, I could tend to turn inward. And when everybody started working at home, I thought that was great. I thought this will be just fine. And it was fine for a very long time. And then it became not so fine. And I had to really seek out my social connections and find ways to first connect with people online and then sometimes in person now too. So thank you for sharing your responses to that. According to Dr. Keyes, a small percent of us experience depression. That's what's visible often to other people. A lot more of us are not flourishing or are languishing. And that's concerning not only because languishing leads to depression, but also because of the missed potential if we're languishing throughout our lives. There are many, many ways we can help people flourish. So I'm going to share some ideas for your own individual mental flourishing. These are individual self-care activities based on what we know about resilience and stress and trauma. What I hope is that some of these resonate with you and you can incorporate them into a daily practice. I realize that not all of them work for all people, but I hope something catches your eye and works for you. So these are reminders because they just tend to, as someone said in the chat, they tend to go to the back burner. I hope they provide you with that reminder and allow you to choose what works for you. So first, accepting the so-called negative feelings of anxiety, worry, fear, boredom, loneliness, grief, anger as they come. And know that these are completely normal feelings and responses to stressful situations. By accepting our emotions as waves that come and go, we can ride the wave, experience it, feel it, not try to block it or suppress it, and not holding on to it either, but letting it move on. Shift your expectations for yourself, your children, your family members, your coworkers. This has not been business as usual, and we all have different needs during this time, and our needs keep changing. One thing in our organization at Extension that we've done is to create a COVID commitment, which restates our organizational priorities during this challenging time. Organizations who use them recognize that business is not operating as usual. They adjust expectations so that workplaces are more effective and employees remain healthy and avoid burnout. They include things like welcoming flexibility during the day, right-sizing the workload for online work, using paid time off if you have it, and that type of thing. It's a work in progress for us, but it's a start. And I can share a link to that too, if you're interested in the COVID commitment for your organization. If you're experiencing isolation and it's hard for you, remember that it's temporary. Take one day at a time. I try to look for beauty outside my window, in my family members, in work colleagues, in the objects around me. Practice mindful breathing, like the box breathing that we did. Stress can lead to shallow breathing and an increased heart rate. Slow, deep breathing helps counteract this. So even if you're still feeling stressed out or anxious, if you physically change the way of breathing, it can help your stress and anxiety. And I can provide links to different types of breathing. Practice grounding yourself. Grounding exercises are helpful to manage acute stress. So for example, if you're feeling particularly stressful in a given moment, be still and notice 5 things you see, 4 things you feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you smell, and 1 thing you taste. These actions can help orient you to the present moment. And I'm going to put that in the chat as well. Take care of your body, rest, sleep, stay hydrated, eat well, move and exercise as you can. My best self-care practice during this time has been to walk regularly, sometimes in bad weather, just inside my house. Keep a gratitude list. Writing down what we're grateful for actually supports overall mental wellness. Gratitude is associated with better physical health, psychological health, increased happiness, increased life satisfaction. More grateful people are happier and report that they're more satisfied with their lives, less materialistic, and less likely to suffer from burnout. I would suggest meditating in very small increments if you're not used to meditation. It helps train you to focus and be aware of the present, and it also promotes emotional calm. Find small things to do regularly. This makes it more possible for you to incorporate them into your daily life. For example, spend 1 minute thinking about what you're grateful for, or take a walk and notice the trees, rather than aiming for a long time in silent meditation. If that's something that you're used to doing, that's great. But for many of us, it's new to us. So starting small, it's more accessible to many of us. Control your news narrative. Ask yourself what information you want to take into your mind and your thoughts. What's helpful now to you to know about? Choose what's meaningful, not what happens to appear in front of you. And choose reputable sources of information and limit your consumption as you need to. Pay attention to how the information you're taking in affects your stress and your anxiety. Remember the activities you enjoy and do more of them. This is an important one for me because it's very easy for me to keep working and forget what I used to like to do. This is hard to do when our schedules have changed, but one of the things that I need to remind myself of regularly. Connect with others. Another thing that we can forget to do during this time, we have great technology to reach out to people. So one of the things I'm trying to do is to connect with people that I have kind of lost touch with during this pandemic. Communication is important during times of stress. Our communication methods can kind of fall apart when we're stressed out. So pay attention to how we speak and listen to others. In general, I try to speak carefully and listen attentively and recognize that stress affects all the people around me in addition to me, and it affects how we all communicate with one another. Isolation can be truly challenging for some. If you are able, consider it as a time for solitude. If you're able to be alone and feel okay with that, look for ways that being alone can help you reflect and recharge. Laughter really is good medicine. In my family, we have created some silly new routines this past couple of years just for the purpose of laughing. And take the long view. Ask yourself, who do I want to be on the other side of this pandemic, and how does that guide my behavior now? And finally, be a role model for others with your own self-care. We all need to take better care of ourselves. I would love to shift our culture to place more value on this. The more we serve as role models, the easier it will be for other people to do the same. So my next question is, what is one self-care activity you can do in the next week? So I would really love for you to share these in the chat, because I'd love for us to learn from one another what we're planning to do. And sometimes when we state it out loud or we state it in the chat, we're more likely to do them. I will also share mine as you're doing that. The first one for me is laughter. It doesn't come as naturally these days. And it helps me take the small things just a little bit less seriously. Given what I've learned about laughter, improving tension and mood and pain, and even improves the immune system, I am aiming to do more of it. And then the second one for me is remembering activities that I enjoy. I mentioned that as a easy thing for me to forget about, but I'm now calling friends and family, being in better touch, gotten together with a few friends that I hadn't seen in a while. So I see that we are putting things in the chat, and Sherry, if you could share those with us, that would be great.
Yes, meditate, laugh more, slow down, go for a walk, spend time outside daily, exercise, dance like no one is watching, try to worry less, learn new guitar chords, reach out to reconnect with at least 2 people, move more, walking, dancing, 24 hours, no social media, alone time, walk.
That's great. Thank you. I love the dance like no one's watching, and chances are no one is watching. So we can all just dance however we are at it. I'm going to try to do that one, saying it out loud. Thank you for all of these. I always get new creative ideas when I read these as well, and hadn't thought about dancing in a while. Thank you for sharing those. That's great. Okay, we have been talking about individual mental well-being mostly. If we're going to address mental health for everybody, we have to be preventive about it. We know that we need to dig deeper into issues that are beyond the individual. Our mental health is affected by things like poverty, oppression, mass incarceration, housing, healthcare access, racism. In fact, we know that racism is associated with higher rates of anxiety, depression, psychological stress, trauma, substance use, suicidal thoughts. So eliminating racism is one clear way to work toward promoting mental well-being for whole populations of people. Self-care doesn't happen in a vacuum. If we went to our separate corners to work on our mental well-being, it wouldn't work. And as we've learned, social connections and social contributions are really important. We need each other. We live within relationships and inside of communities, and we can work toward compassionate relationships and healing communities as we manage our own self-care. A collective care approach, a little bit different than a self-care approach, recognizes that an individual's mental well-being is linked to the well-being of others. It's a shared responsibility rather than the lone task of the individual. When we choose activities that connect us with other people, it helps everybody's mental well-being. We can promote each of these: authentic self, compassionate relationships, and healing communities by starting at any of these three levels. Understand and acting in authentic ways as individuals. If we can understand and act in authentic ways as individuals, we can promote healthy relationships. And if we promote healthy relationships, we can build healing communities, and we can work the other direction as well. So I share this because of the importance of social connections and relationships, which I think is really central to mental well-being. And also because there's more and more work being done about the mental well-being of whole communities now. And that's a new area of research and practice as well. And I think depending on our work and our interest and our passion, we can be working on all three of these at the same time. And in this field of mental health and well-being, we tend to over-focus on individuals, a person's individual risk factors, their resilience or their grit to overcome experiences. But there are significant factors at each of these levels that affects an individual's mental health. Mental health depends on supportive relationships, the availability of organizations that can help us with anxiety or depression, and also trauma and grief. Communities that recognize and support our mental well-being, and also that have supportive housing, affordable housing, accessible employment, healthcare available to us, education available to us, policies that allow us to receive mental illness care, for example, as well as the other things we need to access to meet our needs, and societies that value mental wellness and equity and strong connections with one another. So I like to share this because I want us to think about the things that influence an individual's mental well-being at each of these levels. It's important that we're doing all of them. There's a lot of text here, and I know it's small. The point isn't to know each detail, although I will share this in the chat as well so that you can see a link to this model if you're interested. This is a beginning stage at attempting to gather the research related to mental well-being and this ecological approach. This was created by a group of us at the University of Minnesota and the Minnesota Department of Health, and it reflects an initial review of the literature on these two terms, ecological systems theory and mental health. And we see risks at every level of this model. So there are risks that affect the individual's mental health at each level. So this shows the importance of things as far-ranging as media messages and technology, social connections, poverty, resource allocation, government investment of resources. All of these have a direct effect on our mental health and well-being. So we can change the mental health of whole groups of people by changing any of these risk factors. And this final slide is another way to consider a community approach to mental flourishing or mental well-being. This was created by Dr. Wendy Ellis at George Washington University. It builds on the concept of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, which you might be familiar with. The ACEs here are shown in the branches of this tree, the things that we know can have an effect on the lifelong health of children who experience them. This model shows how the ACEs in individuals are paired with another type of ACEs, adverse community environments. And she calls them a pair of ACEs. It's what's in the soil that causes the branches to grow in this way. So when a plant has poor growth, we look to the soil to help fix it. The soil is where we can intervene and make widespread changes. And while we can also intervene at the upper level in the branches, if we don't tend to the soil, we will continue to produce trees with poor growth. So my last question, what is one thing that you learned from this presentation today? And if you could put that in the chat, and as you're doing that, I'm going to share a few other announcements with you, and then we'll have a couple of minutes left. This is the same slide from earlier. Again, this is one in a series. We also have a broad array of other free webinars during the upcoming months on topics related to food and nutrition, natural resources and the environment, home and finances, recovery and health. And I will put this link in the chat again too. If I can. And if you need a certificate of participation for today, we have a link to an evaluation form that you can fill out, and then you will receive the certificate of participation. Here's the evaluation link. I will put that in the chat as well. And when you leave this meeting today, you will be directed to this evaluation survey. We'll also send you a follow-up in about 30 days after the series is over. So the series isn't over for a couple of months, but after that, we will send you a follow-up just to see how you might be using this information. And then please engage with us, the Center for Family Development. We have a lot of ways to connect with you via social media. If there is one thing here that you might note, it's our newsletter. And if you go to this newsletter page, z.umn.edu/family news, you'll find links to all of these other social media connections with us. And I just want to end by sharing that one of my favorite self-care practices during this past 2 years has been hiking with my family. I am grateful that I'm able to do that. And we've been doing it in various parts of the state and various seasons. I invite you to find one thing or make a short list that works for you during this time. And finally, congratulations on taking time to focus on your own mental well-being and the well-being of our communities. We do have just a few minutes left, and I see that you're writing lots of great things that you have learned in the chat. Thank you for sharing those. And I would just at this point invite you to either put your questions in the chat, or if you have other things that you'd like to share with people, you can share that in the chat as well. We also have a few minutes where you can unmute if you'd like and ask questions to me or to the group. I see that a couple of you have talked about the changing narrative. I'm really grateful for that change too. And I think both research and our practice has changed around that. It's really created this field of mental health promotion. Any other questions or things that you'd like to share?
Hey, Cari, this is Maggie Sonic. Do you mind sharing if you're in the Twin Cities or what region of Minnesota you're in?
Yes, thanks for the question, and sorry I didn't share that. I am in the Twin Cities. My office is on the St. Paul campus of the university, but I do tend to work all over the state. Any other questions or comments or things that are new, things that resonated with you? All right, I think I'm going to wrap us up then. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and I wish you well in your self-care journey.